Today's video is about getting out of your comfort zone and using some of the weathering techniques that I use for armour with something a little bit different. I'm a sucker for a group build and I love stretching myself in terms of the subjects I choose, and today's subject ticks those boxes. So did any of you guess the subject from the riddle in the last video? It is the Russian surface-to-air missile, the slightly left of centre release from a couple of years ago from Takom, the SA-N-7. The kit seems to be reasonably straightforward, with really the only choice to make being if you want to paint the white missile or the green missile. And of course, I will choose the green missile, so without further delay, let's get started. The cradle that holds the missile required some filling and sanding to remove a significant seam line running down the length of that part. But in terms of assembly, it was very straightforward. The filling and sanding were completed, and I'll expand on that process later. However, black superglue was used to fill those seams. The two pylons were again very simple. However, I had an idea to pose one of the maintenance doors open and detail it up with scratch building and 3D printed interior to bring some interest to that part and possibly help tell a story. With absolutely no reference or even a clue of what the internals of the launching system might look like, I set about populating the inside of the pylon as best I could. I'd sourced most of the pieces on Cults 3D as well as Thingiverse and just pieced them together in a visually pleasing way. With the bulk of the hardware glued in place on the rear wall of that pylon, I could then use various thicknesses of solder wire to create wiring and cables to connect all of the pieces and make it look like a functioning machine. The part was then primed using a Mr. Surfacer 1500 black, and neutral grey was then applied as a foundation layer for the interior colour of that pylon. The grey was lightened with a white, and the raised details around some of those parts were highlighted in that lighter grey. With the scene I had in mind, most of this would be obscured, so exaggerating highlights and shadows would help those shapes to not get lost in those deep recesses. The parts were further detailed using a fine brush and a mix of acrylic paints. Again, everything I've built and painted in this area is complete fiction, so I was free to paint it however I saw fit. Brush painting red can be difficult due to its weak pigment and coverage issues, so the air tank was airbrushed using SMS red and treated as a standalone assembly. This is a lacquer-based paint and very hard wearing, which would allow me to mask the brackets only a short time later and spray them in a grey colour. An old piece of sponge can then be used to dab a small amount of brown paint over those bracket sections to give the impression the parts had suffered wear and the paint had chipped away. Removing the tape mask reveals the effect, and this is a simple technique that anyone can achieve on just about any model. With the internals now all painted and detailed, I could apply a pin wash using an oil paint colour called Starship Filth. The oil paint is thinned using a white spirit or an enamel thinner, to use a different name for that solvent. And then by touching the brush against the parts, the oil paint wash will migrate around those lines and recesses. The wash will add depth and definition to the shapes in those parts and help bring the assembly to life. It also meant that pylon could be sealed and I could move on to building the rails and platform sections. I first built the handrails as individual assemblies. The individual pieces seemed to follow a logical shape, so I found by using a quick drying cement like a Tamiya extra thin quick set, I was able to work around those shapes in a methodical way, and they tended to evolve as I went. The kit has two options for the tread pattern in the platforms, so I chose the one that appealed to me the most and glued them in place using the black super glue. Applying the black using a toothpick shows me exactly where the glue is on that part, and it helps me avoid over application, which can potentially clog the fine holes in those etch pieces and can make a real mess of those parts. The black super glue is also reasonably slow drying, which gives me a decent window of time to fit the parts in place. Whilst I had the super glue out, a small amount was used on each of the corners of those handrails to fill and strengthen those positions. The platform and the rails could then be attached to each other, again using that quick setting cement and securing the parts one joint at a time. The same technique could then be used to attach those assemblies to the pylons. And if you're building this kit for yourself, remember to focus on one joint at a time and move your way around the assembly in a methodical manner. The glue sets fast and there is a certain amount of play in the part which allows for the assembly to lock into place. Granted, you have to be patient, however the end result was very pleasing. A sponge was fed into the open pylon which would protect the internal detail from the paintwork that would follow. Sponges make great makeshift masks in hatches or wheel bays and cockpits and can save a lot of time as opposed to trying to mask it up using tape. It was also here I decided to add some bolt detail to the door hinges and used the punch and die set to create small styrene bolt heads. It's a minor detail but should help add another layer to the story of this model. The pylons and cradle are now attached to the base plate, and it's worth noting here that one of the group build participants, internationally recognised aircraft modeller Gary Wickham from Scale Spot, noticed that the hatch that opens to feed the missile onto that cradle doesn't line up as it should. So Gary went to the trouble of recreating not only the hatch placement, but recreating the complete base plate in Fusion 360 and printing that corrected part for himself. This is something I was planning for my own build, but it seems Gary beat me to the punch. I decided to use a pre-shading technique to paint the launcher assembly, so it was first primed using a Mr. Surfacer Grey 1000. To me, a dark sea grey has a brownish green tone to it, which is why I chose it for my pre-shade. I tested the flow and thinning ratio on the underside of the model prior to starting. It's important to test your ratios on an inconspicuous position prior to starting the paint work. The pre-shade colour is eventually thinned to around 70% thinner to paint after my first mix was slightly too thin. I'm keeping this paint well thin to keep the coverage relatively subdued. I don't want this shading to dominate, but to enhance the finish. I'm painting this assembly like I would an aircraft model. I'm trying to keep my contrasts and weathering to a realistic level. It's easier to push the envelope with armour, however I find subjects like this require a certain level of refinement, otherwise they can tend to look odd and unrealistic. I'm focusing on the lower edges of the panels as well as around the shapes. I'm only working on the pylons because I'll use a different colour to shade that launch cradle. To add some variation, although chances are it'll be hard to notice on the finished model, I moved to an IJN grey to shade the shapes around that launch cradle. Because the whole launcher assembly is a light single colour, my hope is the variation in the shading may help create some variation on that finished colour. The application is as it was for the pylons. I'm creating graduated tones in the shapes and working around the details of the part. With the pre-shade complete, I can now apply my top coat of dark ghost grey. Trying to paint these lighter colours like light greys and whites can require a heavy coverage to achieve complete opacity. However, I'm able to use this to my advantage. By keeping the thinning ratio to around a 50-50 mix of thinner to paint and applying misted layers of that paint, I'm able to control the application, which means I can control how much of that shading will be showing through that top colour. It's important to remember this should be a reasonably well maintained piece of equipment, and the shading is purely to add volume and tone in this paintwork. It shouldn't look like dirt or wear. On inspection, I think the IJN grey gave me a much nicer overall tone, but worked well against the dark sea grey on the pylons. I still felt like I could get more volume in these shapes, so the dark ghost grey was lightened with white and was selectively applied. This time I'm focusing on horizontal surfaces and the innermost areas on some of those larger panels. With the base colours and highlights complete, I could now remove the sponge mask and move to the weathering stages. A pin wash is a technique that can elevate the details around your model. However, you have to be mindful of the impact that will have on the overall look of the piece. The usual colour palette of armoured subjects can usually handle darker browns and greys. However, given this launcher is a light colour and should be reasonably clean, I set about making a mid-tone grey oil wash to help lift some of the details around those shapes. A mix of white and Starship Filth are thinned with a white spirit, and then that thinned mix is allowed to run around the detail simply by touching the brush against the surface of the model. Most of the details were pin washed using this colour, however I selectively used this straight Starship Filth to help add body to some of those sections. It's really about creating subtle variation in the finish, as this can help present the scale model in a more realistic way to the naked eye. It's inevitable that some of the wash will look messy and require attention. Cleaning those areas is as simple as using a clean brush loaded with white spirit, or even better in this case, using the end of a Q-tip moistened with white spirit. By gently rubbing the Q-tip against the model, I'm able to remove excess wash, leaving the darker colours in and around the recesses of the shapes. To further allow those shapes to pop, a small amount of white oil paint was dry brushed against the selected details. The key to dry brushing is to use an appropriate brush such as the one I'm using here, but more importantly is you want to remove as much of that paint from the brush prior to starting, and then be as light-handed as you can when applying that effect. More pressure will yield a heavier result. The great thing about using oils to dry brush is they blend more easily than the acrylics, giving a smoother and softer look to the finish. And it's also easier to refine that if you're dissatisfied with the result in any way. I couldn't help myself, and the armour modeler just wouldn't let me finish a model without some level of chipping. So a fine brush and an AK Gen 3 colour called chipping was carefully brush painted around selective bolt heads and on the edges of some of the maintenance panels. I'm being as restrained as I can. I want this to be only noticeable on close inspection and not so obvious when the model's at arm's length. Variation in the chipping was added using an atom colour called steel on some of the bolt heads around the hatches. A black anti-slip tread was brush painted on the rungs of the ladders, and I was then ready to move on to the missile. Construction of the missile comprised of the two main halves, with the stabilisers and fins then attached to the body. A small amount of seam removal and sanding is required, and as I alluded to earlier, the seam was first covered using a VMS black superglue and then sanded back. That black superglue is perfect for this process because it dries strong and will not shrink over time, and it gives me a good look as to the coverage during that sanding process. VMS have generously shared a discount voucher for viewers of this channel, so be sure to check the show notes for the discount code below. The missile was then primed in a Mr. Surfacer black, and the steel elements were painted using an SMS colour called stainless steel. These sections were then masked with a Tamiya tape, and the tip of the missile and fins were painted in an SMS colour called Insignia White. Further masking of the fins and the head allowed me to spray the green sections over the body of the missile. Again, back to SMS paints, and foliage green has a dark but rich tone I really liked, but I felt a touch of yellow could brighten it up even further. I further lightened that mix with a little more yellow and added some variation to the finish using that mix. I can confidently mix the AK real colours and the SMS paints together because they are both a lacquer style of paint. Understanding the different paint types and how they can work together is one of the most important learnings in this hobby. I've put a video together to unlock some of the basics for you, so be sure to check it out. See the link for details. Removing the paint masks is always so rewarding, and seeing those sharp, defined lines, for the most part, is always encouraging. The missile was then coated in a gloss varnish straight from the rattle can. A gloss varnish, whilst not always necessary, will give me the best surface to apply my decals successfully. Once it was completely dry, a few small decals were applied over the missile. The gloss level differed from the finish on the part, however, this will all unite once I apply a satin varnish, which is what I did next. The assemblies are given a blow of air from my airbrush and then finally brushed over with an anti-static brush to remove any contamination. A generous coating of VMS satin varnish was applied over the model, and once dry, that missile was glued in place.
We're missing a sponge.
A sponge creating an interesting texture on the floor of the pylon was inserted, and that door could then be glued into place. And rather than leave well enough alone, I still felt the balance of the washes wasn't right, so another selective round of washes to the launchers, only this time I used 2 shades of grey enamel panel liners from the ammo range, as well as a black wash for the details around the missile. I was much happy with the overall look and sealed it again in a satin varnish one more time and made peace with it, and that seems like a logical place to wrap this part of the video. As daunting as it can be, getting yourself out of your comfort zone is one of the quickest ways to improve your skills, as you are subjected to challenges and subjects that you may never have encountered before. But what do you guys think? What is the model that put you out of your comfort zone? And was it a learning opportunity, or was it just a pit of regret? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your experiences. I'm sorry to leave you hanging with a half-finished project, but tune in next time where I bring this subject to life in a small vignette that will hopefully tell the tale of sabotage gone wrong. A big shout out to my latest killer kangaroo, Steve Ankin. Steve joins the growing list of kangaroos, helping bring you this content on a regular basis. And thank you to my latest wombat warrior, Dr. William Kalmar. Join us over on the Patreon page for behind the scenes access, downloadable 3D print files and additional content. And let's build this community and enjoy this hobby together. And don't forget to enter the draw to win the Takom Tiger as seen in the last video. Entries close at the end of May, so make sure you're in it to win it. And finally, a quick personal thank you to Paul McHugh and Con George for your generosity. You guys know what you did, and an apology to Bruce for being so mean on Facebook. But seriously guys, remember, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family, share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. I'll see you again in a couple of weeks' time.